Welcome to this week's episode of History in the Kitchen. Thank you so much for joining me again this Friday. I'm really happy to be joining you again. In case you want to keep up with my videos or my blog, you can follow me here on Facebook at Teaching History Her Way. Just do a search of that page. You can go to www.teachinghistoryherway.com. That's my blog. You can check out back videos, so past episodes on YouTube. Teaching History Her Way is where you can subscribe, or you can take a look at my Facebook page, and you can follow me on Twitter, History Her Way, or on Instagram, Teaching History Her Way. There's a lot of places to keep up with the stuff that I'm doing if you so choose to. I am so delighted to have you here with me today so that we can talk about the Schuyler sisters. The Schuyler sisters have gotten pretty famous, not just because of who they are, which we'll find out about who they are in a minute, but also because of the musical Hamilton. So please be aware that I'm going to be talking about the musical a lot and referencing it during this video. So if you haven't seen it yet, I'm just warning you that we're going to have some spoilers. If you have seen it, then hopefully you can delight in talking about it. So let's start out with your ingredients and what you're going to need. You'll notice if you've been following me at all that I am by the stove this time instead of getting ready to go with the oven, because we're going to have to cook what my son has dubbed pickle juice in order to make our pickles. So here are the ingredients that you need. You need cucumbers. My recipe said to have 7 of them. It depends on the size of the cucumber that you decided to get. Some of the cucumbers in the store are very, very big, and some of them are pickling cucumbers, which are very small. So depending on how many you want to make is how many you want to cut. So you're going to need cucumbers. These 2 are from my garden. I cut a couple of them in advance. You can cut them into spears, or you can cut them into pickle chips. Okay. You are also going to need, if you so choose, this one's optional, fresh dill. So there's 20 dill sprigs in here. 4 cloves of sliced garlic. Hopefully you can see that. Something wonky with my light today. You're going to need mustard seed, cloves, whole black pepper, a half a cup of cider vinegar, and a quart of water, or 4 cups. I'm actually a little bit short, it looks like, so I'm going to grab some more. Okay, so before we start making our pickles, you're also going to need salt, and you're going to need sugar. Okay, so before we get started, let's start talking a little bit about the history. Let's talk a little bit about the Schuyler sisters. First of all, who were the Schuylers? Who was the Schuyler family? Why are they important enough to even come up? Well, the Schuyler family is part of an aristocratic Dutch family. Just a couple of generations down, they are related to a family called the Van Rensselaers. And the Van Rensselaers are the group of people who founded New Netherland colony, which would eventually turn into the New York colony. So the Schuylers are super rich and they're super important. And so is their family. So they are related to this group of people. They are related to the Van Rensselaers. A lot of them married each other. There's a lot of cousin marriage that goes on in this family. And they are basically responsible for New York being New York. So Schuylers, pretty big deal. So the Schuyler sisters have Mama Schuyler, who is Catherine, and Papa Schuyler, who is Peter. Catherine Schuyler is actually the great-great-granddaughter of Kilian Van Rensselaer. And Kilian Van Rensselaer is the founder of the New York colony. Originally called New Netherland. Philip Schuyler is related also to this old Dutch aristocracy, and he also held a lot of pretty important political positions, both when the colonies were British and when the colonies became the United States. So he served in the French and Indian War as a major. He was a New York assemblyman when New York was a colony. He served in the Continental Congress, which, if you remember, led us through the American Revolution. He was a major general, one of only 4 in the Continental Army, and when the United States became the United States, he was a U.S. Senator from New York. They resided somewhere near Albany, where they had a whole lot of land, so we're talking about a really super extra rich, extra important, extra influential family in the Schuylers. So the Schuyler sisters are going to also be influential because of their blood. So if you're familiar with the musical, you are familiar with Angelica, Eliza, and Peggy. There were more Schuylers. There were a lot of Schuyler children. In fact, there were 15 total Schuyler children. The only 3 that appear in the musical are the 3 sisters, the 3 oldest. But there were more. So Angelica, Elizabeth, Peggy, Cornelia, and Catherine are 5 Schuyler daughters. And then John Bradstreet Schuyler, Philip Jeremiah Schuyler, and Rensselaer Schuyler are 3 Schuyler sons. There were 15 children in total. 8 of them survived until adulthood. Those are the 8 who survived. So there were a lot of Schuylers, and the Schuyler family reached out into a lot of different parts of society. So when the Schuyler girls were younger, they were running into people like Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and Benedict Arnold and John Andre. There were a lot of people that were often going in and out of the Schuyler household that were also of influence. So we can think of the Schuyler family and the Schuyler sisters as socialites, if you will, but they were a lot more than that. So if you do a quick Google search of any of the Schuylers, except Peggy, and we'll talk about Peggy in a second, you'll notice that when they come up as the category that they come up under is socialite. They did a lot of stuff in their lives besides get married, and we'll talk about that too. Peggy, on the other hand, comes up, if you look her up, as Eliza's sister. I don't know about you, but I would want to be my own person, so we're going to talk a bit about Peggy today too. We're not going to talk about Cornelia or Catherine or the boys. Today is just about learning about who Angelica, Eliza, and Peggy were. So the Schuylers were this huge influential family. They were a slave-owning family. We can't forget that. So even though the musical makes the Schuylers seem like they're super progressive, they really are not super progressive. Philip Schuyler, Angelica, Eliza, and Peggy's dad, wasn't interested in abolition. And at his death, he held 7 people in bondage, 3 of whom were children. So that's one myth that we need to dispel about the musical. While Hamilton is going to be a part of an abolition society and part of founding an abolition society, and the attitudes of even Eliza Schuyler changed towards slavery towards the end of her life, the Schuylers were a slave-holding family. So let's talk a little bit about Angelica first, and then we'll start making our pickles. There's a lot to say about Eliza. She could have her own musical, to be totally honest. Any of these girls are, because their lives are full of drama. And there's a little bit to say about Peggy too. So Peggy is not just poor and Peggy. All right, so Angelica Schuyler was considered to be the most beautiful of the sisters. And she was the oldest of the sisters. You may recall in the musical, she wasn't married before she met Alexander Hamilton. Angelica Schuyler Church was married when she met Alexander Hamilton. So they did have this like super weird friendship where they flirted with each other all the time, but Hamilton was never considered to be anybody that Angelica would ever marry, not just because he wasn't rich, but because she was already married when she met Alexander Hamilton. In fact, she was totally scandalous because Angelica Schuyler eloped. And if you know anything about the 1700s and ladies, you don't marry who your dad tells you not to. And their father, Philip Schuyler, did not particularly like Angelica's choice of husband, John Barker Church. And here's why. John Barker Church actually ran away from England. John Barker Church is an Englishman. She meets him before the Revolution. But the reason he runs away is because he is a compulsive gambler and he owes a lot of people a lot of money. He did a lot of risky stock buying and he lost lots of money. So the Schuylers do not approve. In fact, John Barker Church masqueraded as John Barker Carter, and Angelica was Angelica Schuyler Carter for 7 years of their marriage so that John's creditors couldn't find him. So this was not a thing that they wanted to do. Now, Eliza totally helped Angelica get out of the house and elope. The sisters were in on it, not the youngest ones. In fact, a couple of them weren't even born yet. But Angelica is totally scandalous. Eventually, the Schuylers warm up to John Barker Church, particularly when he makes his fortune back, when he's welcomed back to England after the American Revolution. So John Barker Church is going to make lots of money in the American Revolution by being a supplier, and he's eventually going to go on to be a member of Parliament in England, and Angelica is going to move to England for a while until 1799 when she comes back permanently with John Church under the church name. So, and the family, Angelica and John, are going to support Hamilton and Eliza quite a bit because Alexander Hamilton and Eliza Schuyler Hamilton were not wealthy at all. Eliza married into something that she wasn't used to. She went from being this socialite who was very wealthy, living in her father's house with all the finest things, to having basically nothing at all because Alexander Hamilton didn't have a rich family backing him, and the government didn't pay a lot. So Angelica, in addition to being a socialite, and in addition to her totally scandalous marriage, let's show you a picture of Angelica. This is Angelica right here. What a beauty. So Angelica, in addition to her scandalous marriage, was really involved in politics, which was not something that was accepted by most men of the time. However, we have proof of correspondence, so there is existing correspondence between her and people like Thomas Jefferson, between her and her brother-in-law Alexander Hamilton, correspondence between Angelica and George Washington, correspondence between Angelica and Lafayette. So there were a lot of people, a lot of really influential people that Angelica corresponded with, and the letters back to her treat her like she's intelligent and like she knows what she's talking about because she was and because she did. So these men, these very prominent, influential men, were willing to engage in political conversation with her, and she was willing to be the one who started it, and occasionally they took her advice. Now, Angelica also knew, though, what her place was as a female in 18th century society, and she knew that she was kind of overstepping her bounds. So in the letters that she writes to these men and the ones that they write back, there's a little bit of flirtiness too. So it's kind of like, I'm going to flirt with you and flatter you, and now here's my opinion, read it. So she would hook them in with some sort of flirt, and then she would go in to her political statements. So Angelica's not just this pretty lady walking around in a pretty dress and buying a whole lot of stuff because she has the money to do so. She actually is involved in and has an opinion about revolutionary government and the federal government after the American Revolution is over. So Angelica is super important. Now, there are rumors floating about that Angelica and Alexander Hamilton had an affair. There is no proof of that happening, and the fact that she and Eliza were so tight and close and always together, if Eliza got wind of an affair between Alexander Hamilton and her sister, I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't be on speaking terms anymore. So while their letters are pretty flirtatious and they're very familiar with each other, they're not familiar with each other in that sense. All right, so we'll switch to talking about Eliza in a moment. What you should be doing at this point is you should start cutting those cucumbers so that they're ready, and you should start cutting that garlic so that it's ready, and we'll also start boiling some of our ingredients together. The only thing I have to do is I have to run and grab the sugar because that's the only ingredient that I forgot to put on the counter before this started. If you are just joining me, welcome. I'm super glad you're here. Thanks for coming and coming to learn how to make some pickles. I'll also give you the history of pickles. I'm sure that you've always wanted that. And thanks for joining me to chat about the Schuyler sisters. We've talked about Angelica already and the Schuyler family, and we're just about to get into Eliza right after I get the sugar. If you choose to, you can give this video a like and a share. Sharing it during the video is really awesome because then I get to teach more people, which is kind of why I do this. And you can also give my page a follow if you want to watch more videos like this. I'll be right back. All right, got the sugar. Okay, so let's mix the sugar and the other ingredients that we're going to need to boil together so that we can wait for the stuff to boil and cook while we talk about Eliza. All right, so the first thing that needs to go in the pot is you need to combine the water. So this is 1 quart of water or 4 cups. You need to put in the cider vinegar. This is 1/2 cup of cider vinegar. Okay. Right. You need a 1/4 cup of sugar. Now, the fun thing about pickling is it's science, which I think is actually pretty cool. It turns the sugar and whatever you're pickling into lactic acid, which makes it preserve. Super cool. All right, so we'll put our 1/4 cup of sugar in. Salt, we're going to put in 1/8 of a cup, and then a smidgen more. So here's our 1/8 of a cup. I'm going to put in a little bit more. Okay, so we did water, vinegar, sugar, salt. The next thing we need is our pickling spice. So you can buy pickling spice. Pickling spice does exist. McCormick makes it. I decided I wanted to control what my pickles taste like, so I'm picking only the spices that I like. If you don't like the cloves, you don't have to put the cloves in. If you want to make some spicy pickles, you can throw in some hot pepper. You can throw in red pepper flakes. So it's entirely up to you. But in this mixture, you are going to need 1/2 teaspoon of each pickling spice. So I'm going to start with the cloves. Okay, put some cloves in there. And then I'm going to throw in my mustard seed. I like the way these smell. The other day when I was doing test kitchen, my darling younger son asked me, "What is that stinky smell?" So I assure you, the pickles taste good, and eventually you'll get something that looks like this. But it might be stinky. It doesn't mean it tastes bad. And if you don't like the way it smells, after they're done, if you boil a pot of water with some cinnamon in it, that'll take care of that smell. I'm going to put a little bit of extra pepper in mine because I want mine to be a little bit on the spicy side. Okay, and we will give this a stir. The sugar on the bottom should not all be in one clump, so make sure you stir it really, really well. Okay, and then we're going to put it on the stove to boil while we talk history some more. All right. There we go. Okay. So Eliza is actually, if you want to talk about, I guess, accomplishments, which I suppose we could define as things that affect posterity. Elizabeth Schuyler, or Eliza, or she was actually called Betsy by some people, would be, I suppose, your most accomplished sister. So Eliza and Alexander Hamilton have lots of children. They don't just have the one Philip that appears in the musical. They have their oldest son, Philip, and then another child, a little girl named Angelica, named after her sister, Alexander Hamilton Jr., James, a John, a William, and Eliza, and another Philip. And the youngest Philip was born and named after the oldest Philip, who died in a duel. Eliza was interested in military and political affairs. Of the three sisters, she was considered to be the most boyish of the three because of her interests, because when she was young, she liked to climb and play outside. She also went with her father to a meeting of the Six Nations. So because Philip Schuyler was an assemblyman in New York and part of a prominent family, he would be sent to negotiate with the Six Nations, a group of Native Americans that included the Mohawk tribe, the Oneida tribe, the Onondaga tribe, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora. So they were a pretty formidable force as a nation in upstate New York, and they were really important to stay peaceful with and also to be able to trade with for the colonists. So don't ever discount Native American tribes. Often they're discounted because we don't learn a lot about them. These people were a formidable people and a very important people to the colonists. And of course, to themselves and their own tribes as well. So she went on an expedition there as well. So Eliza has a lot of political interests. And she also spent a lot of time talking to Hamilton about those interests. She actually met Alexander Hamilton before the ball in Hamilton. So when they sing Helpless, she met him far before that. So Lin-Manuel Miranda had to take some liberties with the history in order to make it fit dramatically. So the timeline is a little bit different in the play than it actually happened. So she knew Alexander Hamilton, but then she met Alexander Hamilton again in, I think it was Valley Forge, and they fell in love. For her, it was practically instant. For him, we're not really sure, but we think the same is true. And her letters to Alexander Hamilton would not just be their playful courtship, which of course happened, but they were also letters about politics. They discussed Benedict Arnold and Benedict Arnold's treason, and they also talked about the British spy who tried to help Benedict Arnold take over West Point from George Washington. His name was John Andre, and Eliza had a soft spot for John Andre because he was he had visited the Schuyler household. I think he was even a prisoner in their home at one point. And by prisoner, I mean they were treated pretty well. These were not like prisoners that were in jail or anything when they were higher officers. And she asked Alexander Hamilton to ask George Washington, who Alexander Hamilton worked for and was very close with, to save John Andre. Benedict Arnold never got caught and hanged but John Andre did, and George Washington refused the request. And at one point, she stopped writing to Alexander Hamilton when George Washington refused because she was like, "You didn't try hard enough to have John Andre saved." But eventually, their courtship goes through, and they get married. And she was a really big helper to Hamilton too. She helped Hamilton write George Washington's farewell address, which is really interesting, especially for a woman. So when you read George Washington's farewell address, you can know that a female, Eliza Hamilton, had a hand in that. She negotiated the sale or the purchase of their first home. She negotiated the purchase price. Alexander Hamilton had his wife Eliza negotiate that because she was so good with words. And she also edited the Federalist Papers. And by edited, I don't mean like she ran her pen through or anything, but he asked her opinion and she weighed in on the Federalist Papers. And she also likely copied those Federalist Papers for distribution. So Eliza is really involved in political life, or at least as involved as an American woman could be in the 1700s. But Eliza's life, for as cool of the things that she did during Alexander Hamilton's life, during her marriage, it was also full of tragedy. Her life was really sad. She was pregnant a lot. We know that she miscarried at least once. She lived in near poverty for almost all of her life with Alexander Hamilton. So they were not living comfortably at all. A lot of the money that they got and the places that they lived, they were supported by either Peter Schuyler or by Angelica and her husband John. In fact, I think they borrowed the equivalent of the money that they borrowed and were given from the churches. So from Angelica was around $768,000 in today's money. So that's quite a lot. They relied on family and friends a lot because Alexander Hamilton's job, while very important, the man set up the American government, he did not get a lot of pay. So if we want to take a quick look at Eliza, this is Eliza. She also had to live through Alexander Hamilton's infidelity, which was bad enough in itself that he had an affair with another woman. But then, in order to save his reputation, he was accused of while setting up the treasury, he was accused of stealing. In order to prove that he didn't steal anything, he had to write about his affair. He had to confess to it in the public. So what happened is a woman named Maria Reynolds knocked on his door. Her husband James basically pimped her out. He used her as a prostitute, and he used Maria to blackmail Alexander Hamilton. So Alexander Hamilton was paying James Reynolds in order for Eliza and the rest of the world not to find out that he had slept with Maria, and that to the people around him seeing these payments going out. And, well, they didn't see the payments going out, but James told Alexander Hamilton's political rivals that Alexander Hamilton was paying, and people were like, wait a minute, where did you get the money? And there were some issues with the treasury receipts. So in order for Alexander Hamilton to show like, hey, no, this was my money, and he had to say like, I had an affair with this lady and I was paying her husband not to say anything. So she had to live through that, and that's absolutely humiliating. Her son Philip was killed in a duel. And the person who killed Philip was an associate of Aaron Burr, who would eventually take her husband Alexander Hamilton's life in a duel. So Eliza Hamilton had no shortage of heartache and no shortage of hard work. And when Alexander Hamilton died, she was left virtually destitute. He had no money to leave her because he didn't have a well-paying job. His law office was doing pretty well, but they didn't have anything saved up. She lost their house called the Grange in public auction, and she relied on her friends and family and an inheritance from her father, who died shortly after Alexander Hamilton, in order to get the house back, in order to buy the house back from public sale. She had to petition Congress, which is also a really cool thing for a lady to do in the 1700s. Women did not petition Congress. She petitioned Congress for Alexander Hamilton's army pension. Hamilton had turned down receipt of the army pension while he was alive, and a special bill had to be passed in order for Eliza Hamilton to get that money. So she was never rich herself in her own right, even though she belonged to this really great family. But after Alexander Hamilton died, she did, oh, it's boiling, that's good. After Alexander Hamilton died, she was active in a whole lot of charitable organizations. She founded the New York Orphan Asylum Society, which actually still helps children today under the name Graham Windham. So that's a legacy, I would say. She founded several other orphanages in New York City, and she was known to take in homeless children because Alexander Hamilton himself was a homeless child. He had no parents. She also spent 50 years collecting and preserving his papers and letters. She wrote to the other founders to make sure that accounts in his letters of events that she could find out were true. She conducted interviews. She saved all of the correspondence from him to her, but ironically, her correspondence to him is missing. We don't have that. And Ron Chernow, actually, the man who wrote the Alexander Hamilton biography upon which the Hamilton musical was based, he credits Eliza Hamilton's work so that he could do his work in writing that biography. So Eliza Hamilton had an insanely interesting life. And she's overshadowed a lot by her husband, but she too could have a musical on her own because of all the things that she did, and her legacy is still alive today, just like her husband's is in the federal government. All right, so we've got some pickles. We've got some pickle juice boiling over here. That's good. We're gonna leave it to boil for just a second. We have to make sure that all the sugar is dissolved. Pickle actually comes from a Dutch variation of the word brine, pekel. And it was produced and eaten in New York homes for generations. Pickling, the process of pickling is actually like 2,000 years old. And New Yorkers would pass their pickle recipes from one generation to another. So the Van Rensselaer family, to whom the Schuylers were related, in fact, Peggy marries a Van Rensselaer. They were the prominent Dutch family. They lived on the Hudson, and the Hudson was full of sturgeon. They had a famous recipe for pickling sturgeon. I thought I would spare you. I did not think you would like to pickle fish today, but to each his own. Some pickled fish is very good. I just am not willing to try it. So here's the pickled sturgeon recipe from the Van Rensselaers. They also had recipes for pickling cucumbers like we're doing today, and eggs. George Washington loved pickled cucumbers. He was a fan of pickling most foods. And in Martha's recipe book, the Book of Cookery, there were lots of pickle recipes: cucumber, mackerel, even marigolds. They pickled marigolds. You have to remember that these people lived without refrigeration, so pickling was one way for them to preserve the summer harvest. And it was a tasty way to do it too. I've had pickled watermelon rinds, not something that I super like, but I tried them. They were okay. Pickled cucumbers are my favorite. So we're going to take our bowl of cut up cucumbers. You're going to put the garlic in here. Make sure it's all in there. I also added extra garlic too because I really like extra garlic. And you are going to take your dill and you're going to put that in there. This is up to your discretion also. If you don't want to put the dill in, you don't have to. Or if you don't have dill, you don't have to even worry about it. Okay. And once we have all of those things in, we are going to pour this mixture over it. Okay. Being super careful because it's really, really hot. Now, if you have too many cucumbers for the amount of pickle juice that you made, don't worry about it, because the pickles are going to shrivel anyway. And once you jar them, if you choose to jar them, you're not going to have to worry about the pickle juice because you're going to have more than enough to go in the jar. Okay, so here's what this looks like right now, and it smells really good. It's not stinky like my son told me the other day. The dill actually gives it a really nice smell. Now you have to wait for this to cool. Don't do anything with it until it's cooled off. So just leave it on your counter for the afternoon. And then you can do one of two things. You can just put them in a regular Rubbermaid container and then be done with it. You can refrigerate if you want, but you don't have to, because remember, pickling was so that because these people didn't have refrigeration. So you can just leave them in the bowl and then put them in a Rubbermaid container and leave them on the counter. They'll be good for up to 2 weeks. I refrigerate mine because I want mine to be good for a little bit longer than that. And if you jar it, wait for it to cool completely. Put the cucumbers in the jar first and then put the juice in the jar. Okay? And don't eat these for 24 hours. Now, there's one last sister that I want to talk about before we're done for the day, and that's Peggy, because poor Peggy gets the Aunt Peggy, and Peggy deserves a little bit more recognition than that. She's even gone in Act 2 in the musical. So Peggy's real name is Margarita or Margaret, depending on which source you're looking at. But most sources say that her name was Margarita Schuyler. And Peggy was really good friends with Hamilton, a lot more than the show gives her credit for. And she also wasn't afraid of her dad either, because this is another Schuyler daughter who eloped. She was also known to have a fiery temper. She was really flirty. In fact, she was so flirty that other ladies were like at her. They put up their nose sometimes, but she didn't care because she was having fun, and that's all that mattered to her. She wasn't worried about her propriety because she was like, I'm not doing anything. I'm just having a good conversation. I am of the opinion, from what I've read, is that the ladies were just jealous of Peggy because she was awesome. So this is Peggy, or Margarita. Okay. She was accomplished and intelligent. She was popular. And Ben Franklin knew her and called her Wild Miss Peggy. So that should give you a little bit of insight into Peggy's personality. She married a Van Rensselaer. She married her cousin, and his name was Stephen Van Rensselaer III, and he stood to inherit a whole lot of money, and marrying Peggy also gave him that political power of the Schuyler last name. So this was a good match, except that Peggy was almost 30 and Stephen Van Rensselaer was 18, and the Van Rensselaers didn't want 18-year-old Stephen to marry Peggy because they said, well, what if it's just a crush, and what if it doesn't work out? But Peggy, who saw herself approaching 30 and unmarried, which in today's standards is fine, in that standard for her, she was like, whoa, I'm getting old. She said to Stephen, let's elope. So she ran away and she eloped with Stephen, and the family was a little less mad at Peggy than they were at Angelica, probably because they had been through it before with Angelica, and Peggy also married somebody who was of good reputation. So Peggy, there are a couple of stories about Peggy. One story about Peggy, which I can't prove true or not because different sources say conflicting things, so you can take this as you would like, is that during the American Revolution, a group of loyalists came to the Schuyler house pursuing Philip Schuyler. And what they did was they ran upstairs. The whole family ran upstairs because they were caught off guard, but they accidentally left infant Catherine downstairs when the raiders were already in the house. So Eliza, who was pregnant at this point, tried to go down, and Peggy was like, absolutely not. Peggy ran down the stairs and saved the baby. But on her way back up the stairs, one of the raiders saw her and looked at her and said, you wench, I'm going to take you. And she had the baby in her hands. And first of all, Peggy's like, what, wench who? Who are you calling wench? But rather than saying that, she pretended to actually be a servant of the Schuyler household and said, oh, well, Philip Schuyler's not here. Philip Schuyler went to go get people to defend the home. In which case the raiders of the house looked around and they were like, well, if an army's coming, we're leaving, and they ran away. So the myth or story there that we can't prove is that not only did Peggy Schuyler save baby infant Catherine, her sister, but also got these raiders to go away single-handedly because she was super brave. The other story about Peggy Schuyler is absolutely true because we have Alexander Hamilton's letter to Eliza to prove it. Alexander Hamilton's law practice often brought him to the courts up in Albany, and Peggy got really sick, and Alexander Hamilton happened to be in the Albany area when Peggy took a turn for the worse. So Hamilton stayed with Peggy every day until she died, and he was at her deathbed with her. Eliza got the news of her sister's passing from Alexander Hamilton, who was there when Peggy died. So Peggy, in her own right, has some very interesting myths, and she led a very interesting life. So basically, what I'm trying to get across here again is that history has layers. There are a lot of different people involved in the story. So when you're thinking about those Hamiltons and those Washingtons and those Jeffersons and those Lafayettes, don't forget about the women who were there, who had no choice in society other than to be behind them because they are influential, they are talking, they are doing things. Eliza breaks out of mainstream female society, and she founds orphanages after Alexander Hamilton's death. And within the bounds of womanhood, she also helps set up our federal government by helping with the Federalist Papers, by helping with George Washington's farewell address. So make sure that you're remembering that there are lots of different pieces to a history, and there are lots of different pieces to a musical. So maybe there's a character that walked off stage in Hamilton in Act 1 and didn't return in Act 2 that you think is really interesting, that you want to find out about. So make sure that you're looking at all those layers, figure out where the cross sections are, and then interpret that history on your own. So I hope you have a fabulous week. I hope you enjoy the pickles tomorrow. Please send me pictures. I would love to see pictures of your pickled cucumbers so that I can post them. If you so choose, I would love it if you would share this video. I would also love it if you would follow my blog, www.teachinghistoryherway.com, or you can follow me on Instagram, Teaching History Her Way, or on Twitter, History Her Way. You can also catch back videos on YouTube, also Teaching History Her Way. There's a theme. I also have a shirt. And I just also want to thank you one more time for coming, for listening, for letting me teach you this summer, because it has been an absolute blast and I'm going to keep going. So I hope to see you next Friday at History in the Kitchen. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. Bye.